there's not that many waiting. Yeah, I'll just admit everybody. There's only 22 in it, but anyway, we'll just see how it goes.
Good afternoon, everybody that's joined. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes just to allow others to join, and then we will get started.
And if we could just ask everybody perhaps to mute themselves if they're coming in unmuted, that would be good.
Perfect. Does that look, Helen and Ash, does that look about right?
Yeah, I think so. We've got around 40 in. Yeah, just over 40 in now.
Okay. All right, why don't we get started? All right. Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Janine Waller. I'm the Executive Director for the Australian Dairy Products Federation and will be your facilitator for this afternoon's workshop. I'm joined by a number of representatives from across the Australian Dairy Farmers, the Australian Dairy Products Federation and Dairy Australia to deliver today's workshop, which will be an interactive workshop, and we appreciate that it is going over a couple of hours. So we will make it as interactive as possible during that time. I've just got a couple of slides to share with you just to set up the preface for the workshop and cover off some key matters. So just bear with me as I get that up. Okay, hope everyone can see that all right. So just to recap the purpose of today's workshop, so it is very much an interactive workshop. It's all about an information and exchange, specifically for dairy processors. So it is building on the Dairy Australia webinar that was held last week that was more targeted to the pre-farm gate sector. So this is specifically looking at how do we best prepare for or manage an incursion of foot and mouth disease and lumpy skin, but we will certainly focus on foot and mouth disease. Just a reminder, please, to those that are joining, if you could put yourselves on mute, that would be much appreciated. So as I said, it's an information exchange. We will focus predominantly on foot and mouth disease, and there is a question towards the end around how would we like to address lumpy skin disease moving forward. It's about identifying the gaps in the information today, but also the resources that you require to best support that preparedness and managing an incursion. The materials that we present today will serve as a guide. So the majority of the information is extracted from the AusVet plan manuals, and that will become clear in terms of the documentation that we're talking about. The presentations and the recordings will be made available. So appreciating that it is very lengthy, we will make them available, and then we will also consider whether we do a condensed version as well. And all of those materials will be available on the Dairy Australia EAD webpage. So again, we're just trying to have a consistent and single source of information. As I mentioned, the information is processor specific, so building on what we've already learned from a pre-farm gate perspective. And just to try to put this in context from a broader dairy industry issues management perspective, we have pulled together a dairy industry emergency animal disease response team. So there's 7 subcommittees, both pre and post farm gate, that are part of that. And it's all about proactively managing and preparing for an incursion if it is to occur for both foot and mouth and lumpy skin disease. And then if needed, there is a dairy industry national response group that can be activated as well. So that's just to provide you some context. We asked some survey questions ahead of today's session, and that's very much gone in to help shape the content. And these also build off of the questions that did come out of last Friday's webinar that was targeted more pre-farm gate, as we said. So we asked you about what are some of the key foot and mouth disease issues
how much are they worth?
concerned with. Just a reminder, please, to put yourselves on mute. Thank you. What are the key questions that you have, both in terms of preparing for and or managing an incursion? And then what are some of the key resources? So you can see to the right here, there was a number of questions that we received around milk collection and movement. So again, we've tried to address that as much as possible. Who's in control? So the role of government versus industry. What does it mean for processes in terms of your biosecurity measures? What does it mean in terms of trade? And importantly, what does it mean in terms of the consumer and the domestic market? So as I said, we've tried to address as many of those as we can, appreciating there was a number that we did receive. And today, I'm sure there'll be more questions that come forward. We will attempt to address as many as we can, and obviously happy to take questions offline as well. In terms of resources, the common theme was just around consistency and message, and also where we centrally locate all of the information. So just as we did for COVID, Dairy Australia's website will serve as that central repository of information. And then following today, we anticipate it will be really clear around the resources that we need to develop, be it around fact sheets, be it around checklists, be it around contact lists. So I encourage you to please ask questions again throughout. There is the facility to do that, and both Helen and Ash, who's online, and Susanna will be monitoring those questions and helping facilitate that session as well. This is the agenda that we are going to run through today. So 2 parts. Part A is really an information and exchange, and then part B, much more of an interactive session. We'll go through more of the background in part A. So what are the key documents that we're all referring to? And we will try to not use acronyms, or at least explain the acronyms, because I know terminology has been one of those things that has been raised, to be really clear. So we'll go through the documentation. We'll talk about the governance, and that hopefully addresses the question that we received around who's in control. And we've got both Justin and Bill Morgan who will be presenting that information. So Justin on behalf of ADF, Bill Morgan as an ADPF representative. And then we'll go much more into an interactive session in part B, which looks at, first of all, how do we manage an incursion? And we'll go through the 3 stages there, from a livestock standstill right through to when we get it contained. And then we'll go to the preparedness phase. And we've done it purposely that way because ideally all of the queries that come out of an incursion will be those that we will plan for in terms of preparedness. So again, both Bill and Justin will be facilitating those sessions, supported with Chris Thomas, who will give us the milk insights, Stu Davey and Susanna as well. So that is it for my section, Helen. I'm going to hand over now to both Justin and to Bill, who will take us through the next session.
Okay, so I will just assume that I'm taking over here and I'll screen share. So Justin Toohey here. I do advise Australian dairy farmers. So I make no apology for these slides being a little bit producer-centric, farmer-centric, but bearing in mind that there's quite an interaction between the processor and tanker operators. So I think all of this is relevant, at least I certainly hope it is. I'll also cover part A, as Janine mentioned, but creep a little bit into part B as I talk about the National Livestock Standstill, and leave plenty of space, I hope, for questions thereafter. I wouldn't mind starting with a small anecdote. It's kind of a sidebar issue, but it'll help loosen my vocal cords. And it does cover biosecurity more generally, which I think is quite relevant. And it focuses on a trip that I did in 2013 to Nepal. I was one of the lucky folk around who was funded by the EU foot and mouth disease program to go up, and the Australian government to go up into Nepal and actually see foot and mouth disease on the ground. And I just think this slide is so relevant. It blew me away in one particular sense, and a very strong message I brought home. And to explain, the left photo is very typical of the farms we visited around the Kathmandu, the valley to the north of Kathmandu. And there were 2, 3, 4, up to 5, perhaps, head of livestock in each farm. They were tethered, they were milked each day. Obviously, the milk was carted down to the village and sold, or people came to the farm to sell. The thing that blew me away was the green on the right. So one of our roles in our reporting of the trip was to flag the properties we visited, and give a full report on the foot and mouth disease virus that affected those properties. But the green ones are intriguing. You'll see, and I don't know if you can, oopsie daisy, sorry. I don't know if you can see the arrow. Yeah, there's 2 green ones down the bottom left cluster. There's a green one, in the 2 in the middle there, and a green one to the right. Those farms had no foot and mouth disease on them. And these farms are about a couple hundred meters apart at most. They were surrounded by active infection and ones that have been infected 2 weeks prior to 2 months prior to our arrival. What was interesting is they remained FMD free because of their biosecurity activities on farm. And these are sensible farmers who took notice of what their vets were telling them and just locked their animals in a shed, didn't leave the farm, didn't allow people onto the farm, passed milk over the fence rather than have people come on to collect, didn't graze their cattle in the common areas. And so they observed genuine biosecurity, rudimentary as it was, practices, and they avoided getting foot and mouth disease on their farms. So that to me was a pretty strong message that could be applied here in Australia. Biosecurity here is much more sophisticated, but it just shows how critically important that activity is. So I'd like you to keep that in mind, in the back of your mind, at least through these slides and those of Bill and our discussions this afternoon, because I think you have a very strong role to play in your extension work to the dairy farmers. So topics to be covered today by me. Just preparing for an incursion, I wanted to run through the documentation, what we do when foot and mouth disease is suspected and who makes the decision and the governance around that. When FMD is essentially confirmed or there's overwhelming evidence that it's there, that leads into stage 1, which is a national livestock standstill. And then I'll just nibble a bit at the post-national livestock standstill FMD confined kind of bit there with one diagram, but that's where Bill's taking over to talk about stages 2 and 3 and how that influences your operations. In terms of preparing for an incursion, I must stress that, and this is something I suppose that a lot of the media don't quite understand, is that we've had preparations in place for an FMD incursion for goodness knows how long, probably since we built the Australian Centre for Disease Preparedness, or ACDP laboratory, was called ARL, down in Geelong in the 1970s. But we've had documentation signed and agreements signed since 2002 between all the governments of Australia and 14 industry bodies, 13 until recently, now 14, which enable, it's sort of an umbrella document that sets out broad principles of how we deal with EADs. And I think that's an important point to note. We're one of, if not the only country in the world that has done this, where governments and industries have got preemptive plans in place and a huge amount of cooperation over those years to get that done. The EADRA, as we call it in short, is reviewed every 5 years, and it's actually up for review this year. But essentially, it's a very powerful document that we utilise quite regularly. It covers such things as categorisation of 66 emergency diseases, and they are categorised into 4 different categories. Foot and mouth disease is a category 2 disease. Lumpy skin disease is currently category 3. We're actually applying to have it moved to a category 2. The difference between the categories is the proportion of funding. So in a category 1 disease, governments fund 100% of our response. Category 2 diseases, as in FMD, industry funds 20% and governments 80%. Category 3, it's 50-50, and category 4 diseases, it's the reverse, 20-40. So that's important about those categories. The compensation is covered in broad principles and the cost sharing, and developing and managing response plans. I just mentioned the compensation. It's important to understand that record keeping is so critical with all of this, because cost sharing, or let's just say compensation up front initially, and then the cost sharing thereafter, is based on a predetermined formula for dairy and for everything in fact, and it relates to any destruction that is required and ordered under the Chief Veterinary Officer's orders to be destroyed as a means of controlling and eradicating the disease. So record keeping is very important, and that applies to milk products, livestock, if you're under orders to destroy something in order to control the spread of the disease or to eradicate it, then you need to have very sound records where later on you can claim compensation for that, and it can be cost shared across that formula I mentioned earlier on. So a point worth noting. Underneath the umbrella EADRA is what we call the AusVet plan. It's a single noun, but it has a series of manuals as a cluster underneath. The AusVet plan is a series of manuals, and it covers a variety of manuals, which in aggregate are the preferred approach that we have agreed preemptively to follow in order to respond to an incursion. And in this case, we've got relevant manuals around foot and mouth disease response manual. There is one for lumpy skin disease. There is one for valuation and compensation, and the dairy enterprise manual. So the manuals are, there are quite a many of them, and there's a website there you can duck onto to see them. They're divided pretty much into such things as disease manuals, management kind of manuals, and operations sort of manuals and so on. So those disease manuals, FMD and LSD, are logical, and they've been just revised only in the last, they're still in final draft form, but available on as public documents, and are going through the approval process now. We've had a series of those in the past, so they're just a revision. The Dairy Enterprise Manual is an operations manual that is designed specifically to help people who are not familiar with the dairy sector to read it quickly and become quite familiar. So it's quite detailed, and it's the first time this has been designed, so it's now in final draft form, and should be with the Animal Health Committee, if not this week, certainly within the next few days, next week. And the Animal Health Committee will endorse, or otherwise that enterprise manual, I suggest endorse. And it's been put together pretty strenuously by the various dairy industry representative people. Milk movements and milk product movements, livestock movements and so on are all covered in those various manuals. And it'd be worth a visit to those, and we can come in more detail. Bill will be covering that in more detail in his talk. Now, the second point, when FMD is suspected, there is a process designed here around and well documented in the EADRA. I have acronyms all over this, but I'll try to explain them. But it's a bit hard for you to read, but let me just say quickly, what happens is a disease is suspected, and this may involve some of you guys if you are visiting a farm to collect milk, or in any way in contact with your suppliers, and they might let slip that they've got some problem with lame cattle or whatever, or drooling animals. It'd be very wise for you to alert them to the need to report. Every day we delay in reporting costs millions and millions of dollars. And in fact, a study done in 2013 showed that the first reporting of foot and mouth disease in Australia is likely to be on day 20 of the disease the virus being in Australia. Now that sounds pretty horrific. You know, it's 5 or beyond large properties could well be infected by then, and you can think of how many hundreds of thousands of livestock are moved around the country every day. So every day matters. And so as soon as a case is suspected, local vets informed, or perhaps the emergency animal disease hotline that's said to you a few times through these slides, and then it activates a process that sees eventually samples being sent to the ACDP in Geelong, the laboratory, for confirmation and sent back. And then this whole business of what we do is activated. A CCEAD is put in place, which is the coordinating, committee for emergency animal diseases. And that's the veterinary kind of area. The technicians come together immediately and have a meeting straight away, and they meet every day and furiously, sometimes for 3 or 4 hours at a time. They put recommendations to what is then formed, which is the National Management Group, and it makes the decisions around funding and whether or not a national livestock standstill is warranted. And in the case of FMD, yes, immediately warranted. It's the only disease, in fact, that has a national livestock standstill implemented. At the CCEAD level and the NMG level, dairy is represented through some pre-trained vets we have on a list at the moment at the CCEAD level, and the National Management Group level will see the Australian Dairy Farmers President and CEO kind of heavily involved there as well. So that's the kind of governance structure and the timing. We hope for a quick turnaround, 12 to 18 hours. ACDP confirmation is required to know which strain of FMD we are dealing with, and that informs us as to our request to our vaccine bank in Pirbright in the UK. So because FMD is not just a singular disease, it's multiple strains, and you need the right vaccine to match the virus that's been infecting our herds, which is one argument against not doing preemptive FMD vaccination. You don't know what strain to vaccinate against. So that's quickly the process, and we lean heavily on those documents I've mentioned in earlier slides. The National Livestock Standstill is for a minimum of 72 hours, but CCEAD and NMG may agree with advice to extend that beyond that time. The point of the livestock standstill, which is stage 1 of our response, is to restrict disease spread and enable tracing and find the extent of the infection. Everything must stand dead still, and in fact, even animals en route, in vehicles, should stop immediately. We'll come to some of that in a minute. It allows time to prepare the zones for stages 2 and 3, and a livestock matrix is used by the government departments to tell people what to do. So if you're, and this is, you can't read that, and I don't expect you to, it's a very complicated matrix. It's also currently being reviewed, but that gives an indication of where animals are coming from and where they're heading to, how far they've gone, and what you do with that truck that's with the driver's just called in and said, help, I'm sitting at a truck stop in Bullamakanka, which way do I go? So the authorities will use that kind of predetermined matrix to help guide whether the animals are sent back home or sent forward. Now, this isn't quite the case for milk and milk products. They continue as planned. Now, I've just got a thing in dairies here in a livestock standstill. Dairies have to restrict livestock movements to their farms, and this is very relevant for milk tanker operators. Milking must continue. There's no question milking has to continue, except perhaps on those farms that have been infected where the infection's been found. It's pre-stage 2, so we haven't got areas yet. We haven't zoned it yet, but we do have a standstill, and we will know that there are farms that have shown infection, hence the standstill, and they will not be allowed to send milk. In fact, the milk will have to be treated, probably acidified on farm and destroyed on farm or distributed on farm, not be allowed to move. There's some quite heavy restrictions about movement of milk on farm for these animals. And in fact, it might affect their neighbours, most likely, because they'll be quarantined as well. But essentially, all milk will continue moving, albeit under certain restrictions. And we've got some rules there. We've been telling the farmers, restrict effluent on public roads. The tanker routes do not allow effluent on tanker tracks, allow for washing and disinfection of tankers on and off properties and other essential vehicles, record all vehicle and people movements, essential visitors to farm only. Raw milk can be fed to calves only on the farm from which it originates and not anywhere else, and observe strict biosecurity practices, which should be covered by your biosecurity plan. A note to farmers and to tanker drivers is tankers may be instructed to alter their normal collection routes, and Bill will cover that. Tankers shouldn't be filled to the brim to avoid spillage. And I've just talked about the index property about no milk collections. Just the bottom point, the Chief Veterinary Officer will announce when the National Livestock Standstill is over and what restrictions apply then. And at that point, we've moved into stages 2 and 3. I'll just touch here now on stages 2 and 3. So we're post National Livestock Standstill. Bill will cover this in far greater detail, but this is these are the areas. There are a lot of acronyms on this page. I just wanted to indicate that, and if you can take a screenshot or something, you can swat them up, or you can go to that AusVet plan and EADRA website. I said at AHA, and just have a look at the description of all these. It's quite complicated, but people within industry and within government are all over this, and they talk about this as if it's sort of second nature to them. So not to worry too much. The red part is that restricted infected property area and the very high risk area. Then there's a control area, which often is the state border, the yellow bit. The green bit is outside the control area. And clearly very, very strict movement controls around livestock and milk products there. And the hope always is to have some sort of processing facility within each zone, so the milk from within that zone can be, where allowed, can be processed, carted to and processed. Just finally, then I'll finish up now to say, just remember, all edible products from infected animals are safe to consume, and that includes milk and milk products. It's a non-zoonotic. You'll hear occasionally on the media, oh, sometimes it has happened where people become infected, but the only information I can find on that's been 40 people in the 200 years that FMD's been around, 40 people across vast countries of the world, and they've had cuts and they've been actually dealing with infected animals. So it's virtually non-existent, this evidence of getting across to humans. So the movement controls are there only to restrict disease spread and not because of food safety issues. We've asked FSANZ back in 2012, and in fact, FSANZ has accommodated us for FSANZ preemptive statements. And there's a quick website there where FSANZ has only recently posted that those preemptive statements around foot and mouth disease. We've asked for similar statements for lumpy skin disease to say this food is safe from infected animals, from vaccinated animals, and any product recall is around disease control spread amongst animals and nothing to do with human safety. So that's all done. Traceability is critically important. We need to get that right straight away. And biosecurity, there are two actions right now we could do. Traceability, if done effectively, and we hope it's certainly much better in cattle than most, will help us return to markets very quickly. And I think Stu might be covering that a little bit later on. But traceability to return ourselves to markets more quickly, and obviously trace the disease very quickly. And of course, we've talked about biosecurity. The Chief Veterinary Officer will have the final say, no question, and that's just the way of it. Just a last slide here. This was done in 2013, some modelling, but around FMD incursion. The yellow shows the high-risk areas. Now, you'd be surprised, it's around Melbourne, Victoria, quite high-risk area for incursion. Since this was obviously, Indonesia having foot and mouth disease. It wasn't since 1985 or 6 they had it. But now that Indonesia has it, obviously Perth would glow much brighter, as would probably Broome and Darwin and Cairns. But just, I wanted you to see this because you'll see a lot of inland areas around the southeast are really high risk of an incursion. So keep your eyes peeled and make sure your suppliers do as well. So that's it from me. I've got 3 websites there, and certainly the Emergency Animal Disease Watch hotline as well. So thank you, Janine.
Justin, there's a question that might be good to answer now, or maybe be able to cover it, from Matt Watt about the what's the notification process for informing everyone that there's a positive or standstill?
A suspect. I'm not sure if the question relates to an early suspect or it being positive. Let me take it that it's a positive, so it's been confirmed at the laboratory. So the Chief Veterinary Officer of Australia is obviously involved. The what was called OAE and is now called the World Organization for Animal Health, WOA, will be informed immediately. The all state governments will be involved and informed through the CCEAD and NMG. And so a standstill will be enacted, and then peak councils and everybody who are involved in this research and development corporation, so ADF and DA and Animal Health Australia, will be doing blanket communications to let people know around the standstill and what they have to do. I hope that answers that question.
Great. Thanks, Justin. I think it does. And I've had another question submitted as well. So if farms have stock adjusted on a neighbouring property, can they still move them across roads to milk if there's a national livestock standstill?
The word "to milk" is important. If they're adjusted there and they're dry, no, they can't. If they're part of the daily routine of milking, and it's common practice, and they already have certification from their health, local governments and state government that it's okay for them to move across roads, then yes, they must be milked. However, if an alternative way of getting them to the bales is available, then please use it. Obviously, underpasses, walking them down the side of the road, so not soiling the road and crossing directly over the road is a requirement where all that's possible. So effluent on the road is a dangerous thing, because cars and trucks and tankers can drive through that and cart the virus, hither and thither. So that's hence the high biosecurity.
Great. Thanks for that. That's all the questions we've had submitted. So Janine, back over to you.
Thank you. So now is just an opportunity just to ask any questions that you may have of Justin, just in relation to the first part. So just to recap, Justin covered off the documentation and the governance requirements. So at the start, we noted that there was a number of queries around who was in control. So hopefully that's clear. And also what are the reference manuals that are being referred to. So the AusVet plans, so both the Dairy Enterprise manual and then the specific ones in relation to foot and mouth and lumpy skin. So it's just an opportunity just to ask any other questions. Otherwise, we will go into the second part and over to Bill. So Ash or Helen,
Yeah, there's another question in the chat, Janine. So just a further question around the notification, Justin, whether or not the notification would be text, public announcement, or through industry bodies. Matt Watt just wants to make sure, as I'm sure all the processes do, that they are getting the right communication.
Yeah, it'll be all of the above.
Perhaps, Justin, for the companies here, the ability for you to get a message to your suppliers as quick as possible, because I know many of you do have SMS abilities, etc., to your suppliers, would be a great help. Rather, everybody gets it more than once than doesn't get it at all.
And one final caveat, be sure it's official. So only listen to official channels. There's a lot of rubbish out there, and we saw it last week, Australian FMD. So be sure that what you communicate comes from official channels.
Matt has his hand up. Janine.
Yeah, do you want to come off mute, Matt?
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. I mean, I think that's a really important point about making sure we're clear when it's official, and we can do a little bit more work around, what is the text, what's the email, what's the one that says go? Because as you say, Helen, we've got good access to farmers, but us being clear and quick to respond, but not jumping at shadows, I think a bit of protocol around that will be important for us just to be really crisp on about what it is that we should act on and not act on. The other bit that I just wanted to clarify, you said that the Chief Veterinary Officer had the final say. My observation, at least during COVID, was the Chief Health Officer had views, but it was the politicians, depending on their bias and whatever else was going on, that kind of had the say around COVID management. Is the framework or the legislation or the, different in this case, or could that still be the situation that we're facing?
Good question, Matt. It's always a risk where politicians, and of course, something with the magnitude of an foot and mouth disease incursion in Australia, it attracts political interference. We've just seen with the way Japanese encephalitis was managed that it is one of the diseases within the EADRA, although it's category 1, so it's a zoonotic disease. That the EADRA was virtually put aside, and it was run without any reference to EADRA, which was a shame. So because of that experience, now we're dealing with category 2 diseases, so they're predominantly industry, and I think governments will lean on industry to assist greatly in managing them. And I suspect while politicians might get involved, they will follow what we have, as I say, had in place for 20 years. I'm more confident of that. We've had assurances of that from the department, and we'll keep making sure we ask for that.
Bill, I know you wanted to add something to the
just two things. First of all, for Matt, if you think back to the COVID announcements, the official announcements, that's the style of communication we would expect for the official statements, and then along with that would be the other channels. The messages will come from the office of the Chief Veterinary Officer of the states or territories involved. So there really shouldn't be any opportunity for us missing those messages. Can I just add one tiny thing too? The National Livestock Standstill is exactly that, but I think as it's been discussed by us, because it's national, it's actually an aggregate of all the jurisdictions standing still. So in other words, the federal department doesn't necessarily have the legislative capacity to force a standstill across all the jurisdictions. That's a jurisdictional responsibility, but because of this agreement, they'll all do it together. So it's effectively a national standstill. Now, will there be a breakaway from that? I would say no. We've had tremendous cooperation from all the states departments over the years with this. We haven't had to test it, thankfully, but they have tested it
in other disease operations around chickens and pigs, and it's worked really well, although no national standstill involved there. But certainly the order of command has worked well, and we hopefully stick to that.
Great. Helen, I can see you've got your hand up.
Thanks very much. And just to let all know, we are hoping that the state departments will do what they did with COVID, which is to instigate their own connections and the ability to provide some support should we as an industry find that on the ground things are not happening perhaps as we would expect them from the national and state decrees. So hopefully that will also act as an insurance policy about different ways of operating.
Great.
Just a quick question. There's a quick question from Andrew Wilson around the non-bovine dairy species. They indeed will be involved in the response as well. So we're talking here goats, sheep, camels, buffalo, I suspect. So they'll all be part of the structure that I just discussed.
Great. Ash, any other queries? That's it.
No, yeah.
That's everything. All right, so if there's no other queries, we'll move on to the second part. So this is, whilst Justin started to touch on the various stages, this is where Bill will now talk to the 3 stages, or he'll focus now more on the second and the third stage in terms of managing an incursion, and then also we'll go into how to be best prepared. So Bill, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So this session, as Janine has introduced, is really once the flag has gone up. So the disease has been confirmed. We've had our stock standstill period, which has given us an opportunity to identify places where the disease is present, to coordinate the responses. And what I'll be talking through is those responses and how we interact with them. So the disease control is very much focused on controlling the disease. And in a single sentence, the aim is the prompt return to normal trading conditions through disease eradication. So that's for stages 2 and 3. The AusVet plan document, around about 130 pages for the FMD manual, describes how that in fact comes into account and what's done. But right from the outset, the approach is to eradicate the disease as promptly as possible to get back to normal trading conditions. The basis of that return will be through identifying the disease where it is promptly, tracing movements of animals, localizing and quarantining infected and high-risk areas, controlling movements, which is often going to be stopping movement of contact points with infected properties. So that's through the movement of animals, the movement of products from those animals. So for us, milk is very important. The movement of vehicles off and on properties, and the biosecurity practices of those sites. Because we're trying to eradicate the disease, one part of it is going to be the case, and it's unavoidable. Animals are going to be euthanized, and the whole process of euthanasia and then the appropriate burial and decontamination of sites is critical. There is discussion, and I know we'll have questions about vaccination. Vaccination does fit into the plan, but it's got very strong specific conditions at where or when it might be employed. So we've got discussions in the media right now about why don't we vaccinate? Well, Justin has already told us one of the reasons is we don't know what variety of foot and mouth will be hitting us. We have a guess, but if we're not right, that's a waste of effort. But the application of vaccines changes the other controls. It changes the timeline. So we will talk about the conditions to get back to normal trading terms, the elimination, freedom of disease. But yeah, just putting it out there to start with, vaccination will extend the period before we get back to freedom. And so we miss out on the prompt return if we can control the disease. Historically, we've shown we can control this disease. In 1872, foot and mouth disease arrived in Melbourne, and it was eradicated very successfully with the technology and the knowledge that was available then. So Justin has already identified the people who are in control of the disease control processes come from other chief veterinary officers of the states and territories. They have delegations of duty, and part of the documentation is who can do what and where, the structures of the disease control, where disease control centres will be placed and how they're managed. But for things, who calls the shots? It's the chief veterinary officer. What we have to do is we do our normal business within the bounds of the disease controls, and where our activities are influenced by the disease control processes, we do what we're told. And it's laid out in the documentation of basically the bounds of where we're dealing with. So reusing Justin's graphic, this is a fundamental diagram for us to get it clear. The restricted area will be containing where infection is and the dangerous, the high risk properties. So it will be a boundary around and beyond just the infected properties. And this restricted area will change in size and shape as the controls are applied and as more knowledge is obtained. If we're really lucky and we've identified the disease very early and we've got the movement controls right and the biosecurity right, that space is pretty small. The control area, the yellow area, is a buffer zone between the restricted area and the outside areas. And for foot and mouth, a lot of the discussion is that the control area will be based on state boundaries, but it does depend on where the disease is identified. And it could be smaller, or the control area might take into account the state borders because the disease has been found in more than one state. So that there can be, the map could look pretty, could get quite pretty with lots of colour. The outside area is the areas that are unaffected. And while there'll be the requirement for some of the biosecurity measures, some of the sanitation methods to be applied in the outside area is free of disease, and more activities will be permitted, less controls will be applied. Up until a point in time where information tells us the control area and the restricted area has changed. And so again, the outside area, it will change in size and shape accordingly. Disease control manuals are an ARZ, an acronym-rich zone. There's heaps of them. Justin has pulled out some of the most important, most commonly used acronyms in this diagram. As we've been involved in this process, it becomes like our next language. But just picking up the manual, it will do your head in trying to remember all of the acronyms, particularly when you get to the movement control panels. But mostly they're explained with time. You'll get used to them. The people in the disease control centres, they just know it. They live and breathe this stuff. So this is a map of Australia. I've taken this. This is representing the density of cattle throughout Australia. So this matches in quite nicely with Justin's map of where the disease risks are, and Justin's yellow areas match pretty strongly to the darkest colours on the map for cattle density. But we have to remember foot and mouth disease affects multiple species. So we've got our cattle, we've got our buffalo, we've got goats, we've got sheep, we've got deer, we've got quite a few of the animals that live in zoos. So it's been in the news this week. And we've got pigs. So if we look at that map, think about livestock, and for a disease point of view, cattle are the animals which get most affected. Pigs are the animals who spread the infection, replicate the virus most rapidly. Lay over that map you can see in front of you with where we've got feral pigs or goats or deer. All of a sudden you can just start to get a picture of where some of these control areas might be, declared areas might be applied, and also gives you a bit of an idea of why the states would become a control area. Is that particularly for states like Victoria, states like New South Wales and Queensland, there's not a lot of parts of the state where these affected animals are not present. So what's the impact on processes? And for these next few slides, largely I've just lifted the words straight out of the different manuals. Hence they are wordy. I've taken most of the acronyms out. But really the impact will be dependent on where the disease is identified, where we have our milk collection occurring, where we've got processing sites, and where we move our milk. That's for the impact for dairying. And if the outbreak happens to occur in the Kimberley or the Northern Territory, initially there's less impact on us. But as I said before, we still have some biosecurity controls that we'll have to make sure are applied. One of the other impacts will be, Justin pointed out, the infection may have been present in Australia for quite a while before it's identified. So the bigger the area that's affected, the more animals are affected, the more impact it will be on the industries in those areas. So cross your fingers, grab hold of some wood, that the index cases are not in the southern areas where there's a very high concentration of the susceptible species. So again, just repeating the point, FSANZ has confirmed that food safety is not an issue for correctly processed milk, dairy products, meat and meat products. And that's largely based on our processes that are in place already. The fact that foot and mouth virus is depleted in number through processes like pasteurisation, but also based on the fact that we've stated in our manuals that clinically affected animals are not contributing to the food chain. Because we've got that, that's given FSANZ a bit more confidence to come up with their public statement now. We might see that there are still product recalls as part of the disease control. And as has already been pointed out, this is for disease control purposes. And for us, let's think that one of the products will be where milk powders or dairy products get used as animal feeds. Through the course of an outbreak, milk products are prohibited to be fed to susceptible species, with the exception of calves on the farm of the origin of the milk. So we're allowed to feed the calves on a property. And as we're doing this is partly here for welfare reasons, is if it's an infected property, those calves are going to be euthanized at some point in time, but it may not happen today or tomorrow or the next day. priority will be given to infected properties which milk cows for euthanasia, but there's a lot of considerations of welfare get put in there. So there is going to be an impact on trade, and I'll ask Stuart Davey if he can come off mute and just give us a little bit of a discussion on international trade and how that will impact. And that also will flow to some impacts that will be present on domestic trade.
Thanks, Bill. I'm happy to have a chat about this. So I know there's a number of points that are top of mind for people, and people have already asked this today. How long will it take before we can trade again? Well, unfortunately, there's no hard and fast answer to that. The World Organization for Animal Health suggests that a 6-month period post a country declaring that they are again FMD free is a reasonable time for them to commence trade again. But the real issue here for us is that this is a bilateral discussion. It's not a blanket, we've hit 6 months and we can start and trade again. It will be an undertaking of negotiation with every individual market for us to be able to commence trade again. I think one of the good things for us is that in support of that negotiation will be our ability to demonstrate the strength of the system that we have to not only contain the outbreak, but also respond to it, clean it up, and the measures that we have to try and prevent a recurrence of that event again. So definitely the work that we're doing now is incredibly important in demonstrating our ability to respond to a disease situation such as this. So similarly for LSD as well, but I know we're really focusing on FMD today. So I'm afraid there's not a really hard and fast answer to that. Similarly with the question around how will individual countries respond. So I guess it's a reasonable point for us to discuss the fact that there's potentially 3 different statuses that we could be in. So currently we're declared FMD free, along with a number of other countries around the world. The next step might be for us to have identified, or it could actually activate before identifying an outbreak here. We could be in a status where we are vaccinating our herd, or we could in fact be in a situation where we are declaring that we have an FMD outbreak on our soil. If we are trading with countries that are FMD free, our expectation is that as soon as we declare that we have an active outbreak here, those countries would cease to wish to trade with us, just I should say in the same way that Australia does with other markets around the world. We too use FMD as a barrier to entry into Australia. If we were to begin vaccinating, the issue for us is a couple. One is, as Justin has pointed out earlier, that which strain do we begin vaccinating against? Let's assume that we know that and we were starting to vaccinate. The challenge we have is that it's not possible to differentiate between animals that have been vaccinated and animals that are in fact infected with the virus. So it's a challenge then for importers, and so they would declare us, they would seek to treat us the same way as if we actually had an outbreak, whether we had one or not. If we had an outbreak, as I mentioned, the same with the commencement of trade question, the response is very likely to come by way of a negotiation. And of course, in this situation, the importing country will definitely have the upper hand in terms of how they would negotiate with us. So it is fully expected that it won't just be, okay, we can see your system's great and you've now eradicated it, let's commence trading again. We fully expect that they will use this as a negotiation lever and have discussions with our government around, well, things potentially that they have been seeking to gain access to Australia with for a long time. So just purely as an example, a country may have been trying to export citrus fruits into Australia for the last decade, and we've refused on a whole number of reasons. it's quite likely that they would use that as a bargaining chip to say, okay, if you want to recommence trading of red meat and dairy products into our market, we are happy to have that discussion, provided you can also give us access to a few things that we want. So it very quickly shifts from being a single discussion around FMD. So on that basis, it's extremely difficult to estimate how long some of these negotiations are likely to take and how easy they are likely to be. The other thing, perhaps as a precursor to this discussion, I should have pointed out that DAF actually publishes a list of FMD-free countries on their website, and I'll put the link to that in the chat. And I think that's a useful one for people to have a look at as part of their planning. One thing to note on that, there's three, off the top of my head, I'd say there's three markets that are particularly key for us to focus on. So Japan, New Zealand, and Singapore are all FMD free. They're all significant trading partners with us in the dairy context, and I think ones that we need to be seriously mindful of. Markets such as China do have FMD free, but that doesn't automatically mean they wouldn't use an FMD outbreak here as a leverage point to restrict trade in any shape or form. I guess that's all really that I wanted to say off the top around trade. Clearly, it's a big space and one that emerges. We're working closely with the department, with DAF, and certainly working with them to ensure that dairy remains very much part of the consideration, as well as obviously their work with red meat in FMD. So we will continue to do that.
Stuart, there's one question in the chat while we're on trade from Andrew about what are the implications of products made from milk in the weeks before the initial detection? Are these exempt from trade restrictions, or are there nuances? I'm not sure whether you can answer that one.
That unfortunately is not a clearly defined thing, and I think it will be very much a bilateral discussion depending on where the destination of those products are. I think, it would need to be addressed as a case by case basis, I think. Matt's made reference to domestic considerations and implications. Well, I think probably the immediate implication there is, Matt, that a third of our production that we currently send overseas is now going to be headed for the domestic market. So that obviously has some direct implications around the whole supply-demand situation. How does that balance off in terms of prices, etc., for people? Again, it's somewhat difficult to determine a very clear response to that. One, largely because without knowing, the extent of the spread of the disease, as Bill correctly said, it could be some time before we actually realise we've got a positive case in Australia, at which point it could well have spread quite broadly around the country. So it's hard to determine exactly the size or portion of the milk pool that could be immediately affected by it. So certainly a challenge, but just wanted to point out that we are definitely not ignoring the impact on the domestic market as well. And we're working with our business analyst team very clearly to try and understand some of the output from those sorts of scenarios.
Helen, Justin, if I could just add, Stuart's spot on regarding the bilateral nature of this. A somewhat analogous, I suppose, situation relates to the question about germplasm, semen embryos for farmers. And in that context, we're saying to them, anything that's been collected and frozen within 28 days of the infection can't be used. So that's a rule of thumb within the germplasm on farm kind of activity. But as Stuart points out, that in no way will be used as a guide necessarily for international trade negotiations.
Matt, I see your question there around consumer insights in the UK. I don't have a direct answer to that, but certainly something we can take on board to understand more of.
It definitely fell.
transfer whom we can trade with immediately. Is there a list which conveys which countries we will not be able to trade with if Australia has a convergent outbreak? Thanks. Tom, there's no hard and fast list, but the list that I've posted in the chat is the countries that are currently FMD free and the ones that we would expect to have an immediate shut the door response. So I think that is a very good starting point as to how they will respond. The other thing to note is that it is also not compulsory for all countries in the world to declare what their FMD status is. So we have a number of countries that potentially are in what we refer to as a grey area, that we don't actually know what their FMD status is. So it's a little hard to predict how their response would be. So for instance, markets like Fiji, the WOAH doesn't list any FMD status for a market like Fiji, so we're not sure whether it's there or not. I doubt, we're not sure whether they are even looking for it, but it's likely that they would still have a response at a trade level with this. So this list is a starting point, but certainly not the total picture.
Okay, we'll keep going. So Clint, you've got a question there about processing facilities, which I'll probably touch on in the next couple of slides. If I don't adequately answer or provide the information you're after through the slides, please raise that question again at the end, because it's an important point for us to consider. So moving along, so what's the impact on processes continuing? This is now breaking down to some more specific points. So we're going to be, like, within the plan, we are required to ensure that the processing facilities have got good biosecurity, and it's kind of lucky we already do. Through COVID, we certainly enhanced things, but it's near on impossible to wander into the tanker bay of a dairy factory nowadays. There's secure gates. There's secure gates even for the trucks entering. Increasingly, there's even an allotted time for specific vehicles to come in. Once we've pumped the milk in, as part of our food safety plans, we're addressing the biosecurity pretty well. So then there'll be some minor tweaks individual sites might have to address, but we're already ticking a lot of the boxes at the processing facilities. As I go through, there's a couple of areas that probably stand out and need discussion about how we might manage them. The critical one for us is the whole milk movement section. So we've got to go onto farm, we've got to collect milk. And the way that we have been used to operating is that we go from one farm to the next farm to the next farm till the tanker's full. And then we take it to pretty much anywhere we want to, based on our manufacturing plans or our sales plans. And one of the things that's really changed in the time of the AusBet plan documents being first drafted is that the physical nature of the dairy industry has changed. In the early documents, there was a handful of bigger manufacturers, not so many mini micro processors. Milk rarely drove past one factory to another. Now it's quite different. We've got milk moving everywhere, and so that's got to be addressed. We've got to decontaminate our vehicles, and this is again straight out of the documents. For vehicles, whether it's a milk tanker or it's a field services vehicle or a delivery vehicle, if it's going from one property to the next, we need to have decontamination before it goes onto the property, and then decontamination when it comes off the property. And that has got some major challenges. So Chris Thomas has been given as a priority task for his working group to work through that. I know we'll come up with I'm pretty confident we'll come up with some good options. It's been talked about a lot for a lot of years, but we've just got to come down and decide on an appropriate process for managing that. And then, of course, when the vehicles get back to the processing facilities or to a depot, again, they need to have their go through a decontamination process so that the cabin is kept clean, the outside of the vehicle, the undercarriage, the wheels, the wheel arches are clean. The milk tankers, our normal CIPing process adequately addresses the decontamination requirements for the inside of the barrels. So people have to have some appropriate biosecurity processes, and for milk collection, there's a lot of lessons we can take from the COVID about personal hygiene, biosecurity. There is going to be need to address the footwear of the individuals, and we need to take into account if people in their non-professional lives have contact with susceptible species. Very many people in the dairy industry will have a cow or a sheep or a goat or a deer or a pig or more. So that we've got to be aware of that and take measures so that that doesn't pose a risk. It falls within the controls of the disease control plans. So we're required to process our dairy products to the required standard. And there's plenty of discussion in the documents about what that is. For getting to a safe food, pasteurization, the normal concept of pasteurization reduces the viral load sufficiently for it to fit into that required standard. The more heat, the UHT process, removes a lot more virus to the point where probably eliminates all the virus. But it's been accepted that just the normal pasteurization process is adequate to stop the milk being seen as a high risk. But as mentioned before, during the course of an outbreak, milk and milk products are not to be fed to susceptible species. So we move now on to milk disposal and waste management. So again, that point of not feeding to susceptible species, we already have as part of our industry, one of our disposal methods is that waste milk, unsaleable milk products, some of our byproducts are disposed of via use of stock feed. That's going to have to stop. And there are prescribed ways of disposing of the milk. We've looked through the different disposal sites. So the commercial composting processes can be used, but very often and very clearly in the documents, there's talk of using chemical sterilisation of the milk first, and acidification of the milk is the most cited method of doing that. Disposal of milk on farms is an issue that will have to be addressed. Just putting in the effluent pond has got many issues, and some of the issues will be present by the presence of feral animals. If feral animals have got access to the effluent pond, that poses a disease risk, and we've put into the revision of the AusVet plan has given us the argument that if milk can be collected safely off properties and then go to processing, that's in fact assisting in disease control. But we've got conditions on that, as there will be conditions on waste management of anything that has contact with milk and milk products. My screen is frozen. So this is sort of pulling out a bit more detail and again, drawing the words straight from the documents around milk collection, milk movement and delivery of raw milk. And this is raw milk, so this has not been pasteurised. This is what's considered to pose some risk as it moves around. So milk tankers need to be of a certain design, which most commercial milk tankers now are conform to these requirements, is that essentially they're not going to spill milk out. They're not going to leak milk. They've got breathers on them. We cannot allow there to be spills or overflows. So as far as the filling of the milk tanker, it's got to be below maximum capacity. It still can be pretty full, but we just can't see milk flowing over the top of the tankers. That's just will be deemed unacceptable, and it will be very detrimental in public opinion if milk tankers are seen having a milk stain as they're driving around, particularly when there's lots of other controls being put in place. So there are all set in the AUSVET plan conditions where the vehicles will have to be inspected before they go to work each day, inspected when they're at each farm, and there will be checkpoints on roads that they'll be checked. Now, some of these checks will be conducted by people who are engaged by the disease control centres. So this is one of the places where we're going to have people observing what we do, observing our records, and pointing out if we're not doing things quite right. The movement, there will be movement restrictions. So milk will be permitted to be collected and transported in the declared areas, but there are conditions applied, and for each movement within the restricted area or the control area, that will be through the presentation of a general or a special permit. So again, this is a place where things are being imposed on us, and we have to work with it. It's going to be a big challenge. One of the things with permits is they can't just be automatically created. You can't just put a couple of conditions into an app and be given a green tick to say, yes, you can do this. Under the conditions of the AUSVET plan, these permits have to meet certain conditions, and that means resources, people, and they're going to take some time. In previous disease outbreaks in Australia, the permitting process has slowed to a halt. There just hasn't been enough resources. Resources are preferentially sent into the direct controls, the restriction, not allowing the disease to spread, investigating the presence of infection, confirming that with the testing, rather than applying people who will be generating permits for milk movements. So within the restricted area and the control area, we've got matrices which say what can be done where. Milk will not be able to be removed from infected properties and certain other properties that are there. And probably as we interpret these, when the AUSVET plan document is released, you'll get to, you can view it, you can pull it off the website. Most of the milk movements we have to consider are prohibited unless exact conditions are met. So that's going to have an impact. That will have an impact on us. Movement of tankers with raw milk will not be allowed to leave, say, a restricted area and go into an outside area. That's just not going to be allowed to happen. We're going to be told the conditions of collections that a scheduled run will be to minimise the number of farms visited and go from the lowest risk farms first, and then if there's a higher risk farm collection to be done, that's done as the last collection before the tanker returns to the designated site, manufacturing site. And that is, again, as will be controlled by the control centre. There will be vehicle checkpoints. The police will be co-opted into the control process, as probably will many other agencies, and the movement of vehicles within the restricted area and the control area will have to have their permits with them, just like with COVID. So I've generated this image for people to try and get a bit of an idea of what the declared areas may look like. And I've used the department, some of the principal veterinary officers, to assist in a scenario. We're not going to know what the map's going to look like until we've got the actual data in there, but this would be a controlled, very contained, rapidly identified outbreak in Western Victoria, and that there is the controlled area is not the whole state. Now we can see the areas that are not yellow and not red. So tankers will not be allowed to leave the red area or the yellow area and go into the rest of the state. So for people in milk transport, people in the processing companies will well know that at the moment milk does get collected in those coloured areas and goes to metropolitan Melbourne, to the general metro area, or through Melbourne to other processing sites elsewhere. It's not until we've actually got an outbreak that we will know exactly, but if we're currently moving milk into those areas, we have to think that may not be permissible for raw milk, and anything that is permitted will have strict conditions. As I mentioned before, processed or pasteurised milk is considered safe for movement. So pasteurised milk may be permitted to move, but all tanker movements in the declared areas will be controlled. So again, these words are lifted directly from some of these documents and from a period in time, and I can't actually track down exactly when it went in, but it's between 2002 and 2008. The words were put in that there was a general agreement amongst the processors involved in those discussions that the processors would collaborate in the face of an outbreak to allow milk collection off the farms and in a safe manner and to minimise tanker traffic in an area. So that would be the tanker that's contracted by Company A picks up milk for Company A and Company B and Company C and Company D in the declared areas in a defined area. Now, I think this has been tested in exercises, but I'm certain it's never been actually tested in real life, how it could work. And the words that are written there were created before the big structural changes of the dairy industry. So we're going to have to work out how this works, if it's going to work, and we might be told we have to do it. Again, straight out of the manual, tanker drivers have got to be contactable at all times. And that's because their direction of movement might have to change. The farms that they were scheduled to collect might suddenly turn up on the infected or risk lists. A zone might have been changed, so the boundaries. So that tanker needs to be in contact and be aware of those changes in real time. And if there are issues where tankers are moving outside of the controls and they're pulled over at a roadside checkpoint, it may not be that pretty. So already something we've got with our fleets is that many vehicles can be located at any time through a GPS system. Some of that's real time, some of it's not. It's not required in the document to be real-time tracing, but that's something that we know, in fact, can be done by many vehicles. At the point of an outbreak, when we've got infected premises, we will need to be able to do a trace exercise to see what the movement of that tanker has been for the previous 14 days before the suspected case. And within that movement, that's where that tanker has visited the farms, the premises it's delivered to, the drivers that have been present. Now, we've got systems that do it. We're going to have to just demonstrate that it's able to be got out. And we might find there's a bit of urgency, certainly early in an outbreak, for this information to be presented. So if we can't already just lift it out of our systems quickly, that's something we need to work on. And as mentioned, there will be verification of cleanliness and integrity of the vehicles if they're checked. So this moves us again into this sort of difficult to define area. So Stuart's covered some of this. So how do we return to normal trading conditions and to freedom of disease? And there is no...
Can I just interrupt? There's a couple of questions relevant to your discussion around milk movement, etc., in the chat.
Okay.
Trying to pick up on some. There was one about will tankers still be able to take milk samples on farms? You might like to answer something on that.
So yes, I was just so yes, samples will be still able to be taken, and that's part of where we have to apply the biosecurity, is that samples are taken and sealed, that milk is not, the sample bottles are cleaned before they go into the whatever vessel they're transported to the lab, and there will need to be demonstration of integrity of that transportation from farm to site to lab. The lab will need to also demonstrate that they dispose of the milk samples in the appropriate way. So there's some other questions there.
There's one other one too, just on composting as a means of disposing of milk, just asking whether in fact that has actually been tested, that composting facilities would take milk.
Yes, so having done a very limited scoping in Southern Australia, is that yes, proper certified composting process is an appropriate method of disposal. The capacity of these sites is limited, and so it won't take a lot to overwhelm any of the commercial waste disposal system businesses that use composting. They will need to maintain all the records of where milk has come from, when it's gone in, the temperature of the compost. Probably be some surveillance on the fact that virus is in fact not active in the end product. But the capacity of these businesses will be overwhelmed very quickly. And again, this formed the basis of our argument that if milk can be collected in a safe manner off the farms and can be transported in a safe manner according to the disease control requirements, and then put through processing, that's good for that's a good outcome. Because some of these issues we've got to face with milk disposal include environmental challenges and the appearance of milk things. We can't afford to have milk going into waterways. The public just won't tolerate that, and agencies like the EPA have already part of the discussions, but we can't have such a high nutrient load escaping, whether that's for disease control, environmental management, or just appearance. So there's a question.
Container
ISO
travels. Yeah, yeah. Sorry, thanks, Bill. Yeah, that one.
So isotainers from Joe. Yeah, so for the isotainers, yes, they'll have the same requirements for demonstrating integrity and sanitation. And there's a point which I probably glossed over, is that like we experienced with COVID, our state borders are going to be a bit more resistant to movement. I don't think we're going to be allowed to move product between state jurisdictions. So that will address the issue about moving over Bass Strait, but the isotainers will need to conform to the same sort of conditions that the tankers are, is that they don't leak, they have integrity. People can't just open them up easily, and that they can be sanitized as they're moved. So Luke's asked the question about movement of milk from RA and CA where there's no processing facilities. So that's within the movement matrix, that is accounted for. So if there is no processing facility within the RA or CA, then there are strict conditions of milk being moved outside, and that will be dictated very much from where what properties it's picked up from. So yeah, week's time or a couple of weeks, when the documents are available on the website, we've got our milk movement matrices. They'll probably give you a headache for the first 2 hours, but once you get your head around them, they'll tell you what may be permitted, but we can't make that decision. We have to put in a request to see whether something can be done. And if we're told we can't move the milk where we want to, we've got to live with that. We've got to follow the instructions. So has that covered the questions? There's one from Matt.
I'll probably go for now.
Yep. So Matt, we'll come back to your question at the end. Okay. So so returning to trading conditions, the freedom from infection. Now, freedom from infection is actually quite different from whether trade is allowed. This section I find quite intriguing. There are prescribed processes to get to freedom from infection. So that involves the record and demonstration that the control activities have been successful, that the clinical disease is not present, that the spread of infection is not occurring. All that information has to be submitted with a huge folio of evidence to various agencies, which include, well, for the determination of freedom, it has to be submitted to the World Organization of Animal Health. And they go through the revision of that and the acceptance. With surveillance, demonstration of having a competent veterinary process, we've got competent testing methods are all involved in that. So to get to the disease-free status may be quite a bit of time. And Stuart mentioned there's the 6-month period after the last seeing disease is a point where trade can begin. Under the WOA terrestrial code documents, FMD freedom occurs 12 months after the last clinical signs have been seen in conditions where vaccination is not being carried out, where vaccines have been vaccine has been put in place. That may be now 24 months with the demonstration of evidence that there's been no FMD transmission. So this comes back to the concerns of the disease control over the application of vaccine. If it has to be applied, it pushes out the time. But as Stuart mentioned, trading may occur before we get to that point, but we don't get onto that glory list that Stuart's put the link in until we've got disease freedom. So the next couple of slides I've called preemptive activities. So these are the things we can do now. These activities are all outlined in the AusVet plan procedures as being required as part of the controls. But they also fit in with our own farm QA requirements and our factory QA requirements. When we've got the first point there is updating the farm's biosecurity plan. So as a requirement for quite a number of years, dairy farms have needed to have a biosecurity plan as part of their farm QA system. And very many people have got a document, but according to a recent survey, it's not a huge number. You could actually say these are active plans that would help prevent disease incursion. So, but that's something where we can act right now. We can start getting people to update. Ashley, if you could show people the link to how they get to the pro formas and the templates for updating a biosecurity plan. There's a really neat little app that's available now that guides people through it. And that, as Justin showed you from his opening slides in Nepal, individual farms biosecurity approach will make a huge difference. And we know there are some farms out there who are going to be biosecured. They already demonstrate that pretty well, but there's quite a lot that are not. So part of that plan is maintaining a register of who visits the farm, vehicles that visit, and when. And that's going to be absolutely critical for us if an outbreak occurs in doing the traceability exercises. Well, it won't be an exercise by that stage. Now's not a bad time to sort of say to people, do you really need to move stock on or off the farm? So don't have unnecessary ones. And if you're able to do it in a way that stays within the contiguous boundaries of your enterprise, so they're not going to be contacting other stock, other susceptible animals, all the better. It might seem strange that we've got to point out that people need to keep their national vendor declarations up to date, make sure they're clear, they're complete, and they're correct. But so many vendor decks lack some part of detail. Now, hopefully it's vast improvement for where people are doing it online. But again, for the ability to do tracing, it's critical. And again, this is already on the Dairy Australia website, was introduced in the seminar last week, is do a risk assessment of visitors who come and go from the farm. Do that for staff. If someone comes onto your farm, whether it's an employee or it's a field staff from a company, do you know whether they have regular contact with susceptible animals? If you've got people who work for you, do they work for other farms as well? So these are quite simple things for us to point out and to assist the farms that we work with to be a bit more protected. So one of the other things, and this is for us to protect the farm, but also us to protect ourselves, is can we identify now which of the farms have tanker driveways, or what's being described in the documents as dairy aprons. So this is flat areas, the turning circle These are areas where animals routinely shouldn't be, but animals might be. So really big one is people who use the tanker driveway as a stock track. We've got to stop that, and we're going to get to the situation if an outbreak does occur. Tankers won't be permitted to go up those driveways. Well, they can go up, but it makes them unusable potentially until they're truly decontaminated. So where does the tanker drive through dairy effluent, liquids that run off the dairy yards? And we've got our systems in place already where we can see how much milk is collected, so we can pay people, but keeping an eye on that. And if we've got farms that have got unusual reductions in volume, find out why. Is it that they've dried animals off, or is it that they've got a sick herd? This might be one of the early signs for infection, and certainly in some of the reviews of outbreaks in countries like Japan and the Netherlands and the UK, that was one of the early indicators for farms. So again, another point, can we make sure that milk rooms are clean, free of livestock? This is a normal requirement, but it's not always done. Can the tanker driver get the milk out of the vat and they stay clean? Or do they have to negotiate their way past buckets or tubs of fermenting milk and old colostrum and stuff? If the tanker driver is getting dirty, it's going to be harder for him to decontaminate. He poses more of a risk. So we're really asking the farms to look after themselves, and that will mean that we can help look after them as well. Make sure that other company people who visit the farm are applying biosecurity measures, and definitely make a clear appearance that they're doing that. That will keep us in a better relationship with the farms. And something that's already started to filter out there is, if anyone has travelled outside of Australia and they've travelled in an FMD affected area, stay away from farms for at least 7 days after they get back. Make sure they're not wearing the clothing that they wore in those affected areas. So let's run through the slides and we open up, and I see there are a number of questions.
There's one immediately, Bill, that follows on from what you were saying from Joe about tanker access and restriction to effluent, just saying that there's a risk also with farm machinery that uses the same track, such as tractors, four-wheel drives and calf feeders. Is this type of track activity less or same risk as stock being on tanker tracks?
It's certainly a heightened risk. If the vehicles have come out of paddocks, definitely tractors driven fast break up the track, so that makes them the condition is going to be worse. So yes, it adds to the risk, and yes, that's part of what we need to identify at farms and communicate with the farm to take those risks away, because it might impede or prevent milk collection where the disease controls would otherwise allow us to collect the milk. So that sort of work, it's a bit of work that between the transport companies, the transport divisions and field services certainly can work on. And it's something that can be done now before disease actually turned up. There's Ashley's comment.
Maybe we can just ask if we missed any questions. Now's the time perhaps for people just to ask them again, because they may well have been answered in the meantime.
A really handy visual reminder to separate potentially contaminated vehicles from tanker tracks and such is to use those plastic tape that you can buy from the hardware shop, a red and white stripe, whatever, and run it around the fences and exclude public areas from paddock areas and such. And it would allow the
But you're
farmer
probably better off using the
allow the farmer then to be aware. So it's such an automatic thing to hop on your quad or whatever and just drive up the driveway. But if you put that tape around it, just as a visual reminder.
Helen, is it worth sharing the question from Matt to Bill just in relation to the disposal?
Yeah, yes.
I can't quite hear you, Helen.
Would you like to do that, Janine, or would you want me to read it out?
So I'm just reading it here. It's how do we manage
Okay, sorry.
intra-zone movements as well as how we'd manage permits. So first of all, for milk disposal. So Matt, is that farm-based or factory-based milk disposal?
It's more of a process question, I guess. I mean, what I heard is there's still some things we've got to work through in terms of deciding actually, given a different landscape between processes and also, whether composting or chemical. I'm just interested is how will that be decided? How will we funnel that? How we assemble ourselves at an industry level to make those decisions? Because there's a group between government and individual processes that will help us get consistency.
Yes, so that Matt is something that we actually, like what you're suggesting is what we do need to do. The OSVET plan, there's an OSVET plan for decontamination and an OSVET plan document for disposal, which covers milk disposal. It's also covered in the dairy industry manual as well as the foot and mouth disease manual. And they certainly talk about, from a very technical point of view, how to dispose of milk and sanitize milk and then dispose of milk. But some of it needs some practical intervention of how we actually manage that. So one of the examples is that milk is acidified using, often citric acid is referred to, but any acids will do, and that will kill the virus. And then that milk is diluted and that can be dispersed onto surfaces. Talks about the conditions so that you don't have so much that you're beginning to get odor and or nutrient challenge to environments. But there's a physical challenge there also, in that the acidification of milk to the level that is needed, that milk stops being a liquid and starts being a solid. So if we've got a big volume, we're not really wanting to turn a tanker into a cheese vat. So yes, we need to have some further working of how we actually manage it. And again, that is the basis of our argument that where milk can safely be collected and safely processed, it should be.
Janine is doing the wrap up. This is, opportunity, Matt, through the ADPF to take that leadership with the companies to work through any issues that will need either a practical interpretation or haven't yet been addressed. And I'm sure Janine will follow up with that at the end of this session.
Yeah, I'm madly doing a slide, hopefully, that captures sort of key outputs that we are going to cover, but can recap on that.
So Stuart's asked the question, consistency with vets and their approaches on farm in dealing with outbreaks. So yes, the vets are also under the controls of the chief vet officer through an outbreak. There's a lot of work, a lot of training has been put into veterinarians over the years for being able to identify the diseases and how their approaches, when they identify them, what to do. I mean, there is the hotline number there. There are a lot of vets have got experience with conditions like foot and mouth. So the last, I'm going to say 10 years, it's probably not quite 10 years, there's been quite a number of government and private veterinarians taken to countries like Nepal. There were hundreds of vets from Australia and New Zealand went to the UK for their various outbreaks, have got experience. Those people are still can play a role in outbreak management, but very definitely there's time being put in now with practicing vets on how to diagnose and deal with the outbreak. The strength of that is that, particularly with states like Victoria, there are lots of vets in rural areas. The weak point that everyone has identified and people talk about is the vets in the peri-urban areas. So they might deal with a sheep or a cow or a pig now and then, but their main work is inside a clinic. But peri-urban animal health management has been identified as an area that needs attention, and it's getting attention.
So Steve Aldridge has asked a question, Bill, and not for you or for Justin, and I'm not sure you'll be able to answer it, but what do you think the likelihood is now of an incursion into Australia?
Yeah, I could answer that. I attempted in the chat a little earlier. So there's an expert working group was put together. There's a fancy name for it. I was one of the members, and it's an academic kind of modelling exercise that's well accepted scientifically, and you get a lot of experts in the room. I think there were 20, where we all have presentations on the disease and the circumstances of the time, and then you're asked to give an assessment of your least and most likely probabilities in your head of an incursion over the next 5 years, and where you think the median is, not the average, but the median. And out of that sort of group of 20, three figures per, three figures per person, 20 people, 60 figures, they devise these averages. So that's how it's worked out. Lumpy skin disease went from 8% to 28%, and foot and mouth disease figures went from 9% to 11.6. So that's not as big a lift in FMD as you'd think. Having said that, that was post entry into Indonesia, but pre-Bali. So you could say that if they ran that exercise again post-Bali, there could be a slight lift. I think the difference, certainly in my head and my participation in that, was the problem for lumpy skin disease, it's insect-borne. There's very little we can do about it. If there's a strong monsoonal wind dragging them, a vector down, an insect down into Australia or through Timor and down into us, there's really nothing much we can do about that. However, with foot and mouth disease, we can put in place all the sort of biosecurity rules and regulations and activities that are being done now, pre-border, at border and post-border. So I think that keeps that probability for foot and mouth disease down as well. What do I think the probability is now from Indonesia? I think it probably still sits around at sort of low teens, but that's over the next 5 years. Who knows? It could happen tomorrow. All I could say is we are as prepared as we possibly can be. No doubt we'll be caught short with something, but we've done ourselves to death on foot and mouth disease. It's really been the guiding light for our entire EAD preparedness exercises and activities over the past 20 years. So foot and mouth disease is always seen as the worst one, and we've focused on that. But that's pretty much where we sit right now, I think.
It might sound counterintuitive, but and foot and mouth is certainly very serious, but it's quite straightforward also. The nature of the infection, as Justin said, insect vector-borne disease is much more challenging to not only prevent but also to manage. Foot mouth is going to be dramatic, but it's predictable.
Yeah, and as we are talking on lumpy skin a little bit today, and I know it's an FMD focus, but a couple of interesting snippets probably. One, for the dairy sector, I think importantly, it's most likely, not guaranteed, but most likely to come into Northern Australia because of the insect-borne nature of it. Whereas foot and mouth disease is most likely to come in around a capital city where we're getting a lot of tourists bringing rubbish in, maybe some spare meat in a subway, as they did the other day in a rubbish bin, and feral pigs taking it. And Melbourne's a very high risk city because it's so close to livestock. The surrounds of Melbourne are very close to livestock. So that's a real distinction. Ross Ainsworth is a vet from Northern Australia and a bit of an expert in the Indonesian trade, live cattle trade. Put an article together for Beef Central this last week around when we may expect lumpy skin disease to be at most heightened probability of entering. And he said, why has it not spread further south from where it currently is in Sumatra? And the answer is because in entering Sumatra, the northerly winds, north and easterly winds were predominant at that time of the year, and now they've turned around to south. But when the next season comes in the north, they'll push back further down. It moves about 2,000, 2,500, can move 2,500 kilometres in a season through the insect movements, which would potentially put into Timor. So his prediction potentially is the monsoonal season of 23-24 is possible for LSD to get into Northern Australia. If not, then possibly the monsoonal season after that. So that's a bit dire. That's why that expert group has it such a high percentage, 28%. It's just moved by vectors. What we don't know about lumpy skin is the competency of buffalo fly as a vector, but I suspect it'll be pretty heavily implicated in the movement of the virus.
Well, I might jump in. I've got some questions. Sorry, I've been doing a couple of other things, so please let me know if it has been asked. But one of the questions that's come in, so if a processing facility is designated as a DCPF, I thought I was pretty good with acronyms, Justin, but you have introduced a whole suite of new ones. So if a processing facility is designated as a dangerous contact processing facility, can raw milk still be received from the control and then from outside areas?
So in general, the answer is yes. It can, with the conditions that are attached there. Also, it's envisaged that a dairy processing site would be able to decontaminate reasonably effectively. So it may not stay as a DCPF for that long. And there's been probably more work being done on decontamination of abattoirs, which are more difficult to decontaminate, but there's certainly provision for them to change category back to being just a normal approved processing facility.
The real extent of the decision, when it comes to these conditions, is to do whatever you can to minimise the potential for spread of the disease. So the lower probability will determine the direction of the product. And sometimes it's better to take a risk and move it to a particular facility than it is to distribute it, disperse it on farm, even after acidification. And it's, the environmental impact of that over a long period obviously has an impact as well.
Yeah.
There was a question earlier on too about compensation for milk in the event of a herd being destroyed.
That's right. So if a farmer did have their dairy cows disposed of, is there any compensation for the loss of the milk?
I think the answer to that's yes. So that's why it comes down to really good record keeping, provided. So there's no compensation for continuity of income, right? Let's put that aside. So it's not about we're not able to sell milk now, so please compensate us. It's about, was that milk destroyed in the process of controlling the disease? And so if you're destroying livestock on a farm and there happens to be milk in the vat and that has to be destroyed as well, that would be taken into account for compensation. And so records should be kept for that, and photos taken, and all that's, do what people can to keep a record of that. What was the other point I wanted to make? It's escaped me right now. It'll come back to me.
So the question.
Oh, sorry, that was it. I just thought of it. Thanks, Bill. Yeah, so that's why it's very important for cows to be dried off rapidly if they're in that quarantine zone. So we're not unduly destroying the environment with destroyed milk, jettison the destruction of milk on farm, and we're not having to deal with high compensation rates for milk, etc. So drying off quickly is important as part of the management strategy. Thank you.
No worries. Phil, did you want to jump in?
There was another question I've seen in the return to freedom status with a nation full of feral pigs. And while eradication of pigs is going to be immensely challenging, and of all animals to try and get rid of, they're probably the most challenging, there'll certainly be a lot of effort will be put into depopulating, and then in those areas, use of serology to see if there's ongoing spread, and they'll just keep whittling away at the feral populations until they've stamped things out.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind making a comment on that too, if I could. Sorry, Bill, did I?
Yep, go for it.
So it's really difficult to know how implicated feral pigs will be. Obviously 26.5 million or 27 million pigs in this country is going to be impossible, with them. But a study was done, I think around maybe 2015, that time, by a guy called Brendan Cowlard, who used salmonella as a facsimile for foot and mouth disease and studied the spread of that up in the Kimberley, and determined scientifically, a peer-reviewed study, that the virus in the feral population of pigs is not nearly so relevant as it is in the cattle. And if you eradicate it from the cattle, the pigs will in fact die out, be less. So they're not as impactful as we think. And returning to market access will depend on the strength of argument we put about our surveillance system, therefore. So we can't possibly guarantee we've killed every pig in the country and there's no FMD in any of the feral pigs in the country, but we can give them strong evidence of a really powerful surveillance system that shows no evidence in all these bits and pieces for the past 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, whatever. And that's where our weight of argument will lie.
Great, thank you. This is another point that I actually stole off of Vet when I was over in Perth last week for a conference. He also noted that because of the blisters and the sores they get on their feet, they also stop moving. So it's unlikely that the pigs will continue, running around like they do and spread it. Just another point that he made. So another question that was submitted earlier was how long might it take for Indonesia to move from red to green? Red to light green to help stem some of the panic. Mind you, we're trying to capitalise on the panic. We're really getting farmers focused on biosecurity, which is great. But how long might that take? Do we have any ideas?
Answer, Justin?
Yeah, only in the sense that some people are saying it could be anything from up to 10 years. I mean, the difficulty for Indonesia is it's nowhere near as structured a response as we have here. Having said that, they eradicated it in 1986 with our help. And they have enlisted the assistance now of the emergency defense force, emergency, I'm not sure what it is, or the military or something, but it's much more orchestrated in their vaccination programs now than they were 2 weeks ago. And Mark Shipp, our Australian CVO, is much more optimistic now that since they've done that. The other interesting thing about that is that wild foot and mouth disease is a real issue for Indonesia, and they've become really focused on it. They've dropped the ball a little bit on lumpy skin disease and really not even reporting on it or anything. But what they have agreed to do is when the vets and the Defence Force and such go out to vaccinate cattle for FMD, they're also vaccinating for LSD. So in a funny way, the FMD outbreak is helping us control LSD in the northern areas. So vaccination is happening, because if it weren't for that, I think LSD would be far more spread than it is now.
So in addition to that, Ashley, there is some reports over the last week that the rate of spread of FMD is slowing, and certain areas it's been halted. Australia's as Justin said, Australia's been applying some of our resources there, and it's during this week or next week. Australian vaccine will be on the ground in Indonesia, and the larger companies, agricultural companies in Indonesia, are taking it very seriously, which is allowing the government response to target the local smaller scale farmers. And for those bigger farmers, a lot of them have got very close ties to Australian agribusiness, and they're applying biosecurity.
Good. That's great.
Bill in the thing, sorry, Ash, just came in about compensation. Whilst we've talked about compensation for farms for loss of animals or loss of milk, for processors, there'll be a fair bit of extra handling if you're looking at the index farms and logistics. Just wondering, any thought being given to that?
Maybe I could have a shot at that. The point about compensation more generally is that anything considered above and beyond the course of normal events, they call it normal commitments, needs to be well recorded and could potentially be okay for compensation. So while I can't say yes, I'd say keep really good records and support your argument for it. So obviously everything's going to go pear-shaped. It's going to cost us all a heap of money. Everyone's going to be, working 24/7 to try and do things. But a lot of that is, even an extension to normal work hours can be considered normal commitments. People have to make a bigger effort. But sometimes there is stuff above and beyond that, and that's employing staff specifically for the particular purpose around disease control. Those sorts of things could well be okay for compensation. So make a record of them and put the argument.
Great. Thank you. You didn't have anything to add there, Phil?
Justin's got a very elegant way of explaining that stuff.
That's good. So I might just move on to decontaminating footwear between farm visits. So I did post in the chat, Dairy Australia has published some specific information with regards to foot baths, including a video that is coming. Steph Bullen, someone in our farm team, has recorded a video on foot baths and how to do it correctly. But just wanted to, check if there was any other measures that processors or field staff, milk tank operators should be considering with regards to decontaminating footwear between farms. Or not just footwear? Should it be expanded from that as well?
Hand hygiene too, I suppose.
Yeah, so there's elements covered in the decontamination manual for AusVet Plan. There's been discussion about things like overboots and boot scrubbers, and a lot of it does depend on the nature or the extent of what's required. Will be dependent on the level of contact. So if you're only contacting the bottom of your boots on a acceptably structured driveway, then addressing the bottom of your boots. If you're handling animals, which dairy processors generally don't do, but if you happen to be in the dairy shed milking, then there's going to have to be more PPE used, more decontamination. So I think that sits in some of the materials that the department are constructing.
Yeah, so in a practical sense, when we went to Nepal, we were handling infected animals, even pulling out tongues and having a look at the blisters and some of the poor devils, their skin sloughed off. It was awful. But anyway, our process there was to step onto this is extreme, right? Was to step onto a piece of orange PVC kind of sheeting that had been spread across the road a bit, and we'd step onto that. That one side was clean, considered, and the other side was considered dirty, and you'd wash your boots, and you'd spray your entire sort of suit. It was proper PPE, full clothes stuff. You'd spray yourself with mild citric acid solution. I mean, that's the extreme. Clearly, our guys aren't going to be as infected as that. But, you know, that's the sort of thing the vets might have to think about.
That is stuff that the vets go through, and the AHA have got some very good videos for full personnel decontamination, which includes lists of what's needed to put together for the kits. And then we applied that through the equine influenza outbreak in 2008.
Yeah, okay.
But that's for intimate contact with the animals.
Yeah.
Direct contact.
Bill and Justin, you might like to comment on this. I think the really important thing for us, and I know at DA we're already talking about staff who need to go on farm to visit, is actually living what we're preaching about biosecurity and taking all precautions. So it's really going to be important for everybody knowing what the requirement should be, and then making sure that we actually do implement those rather than just talking about having a plan. Appreciate your thoughts on that.
Absolutely agree. Some of the discussions that have occurred in the last couple of days is what are the consequences for us if we preach one thing and do something else? And certainly, and from the example within equine influenza, it doesn't take many events where someone is seen to not be so good at their biosecurity procedures for it to become pretty well known. And the Bush Telegraph is pretty quick, as we know. So it will be very detrimental to our ability to control the disease if any part of the control process doesn't live up to what it says it's going to do.
Yeah, I totally agree, Helen. As a rather funny example of that, you know, with authorities are suggesting we wear masks again for COVID, which seems to me to be pretty sensible if you're in public areas. And you look, and they're saying, well, politicians are saying that, and they should also wear masks. I don't know how many people saw the opening session of Parliament yesterday, but all the Labor side all had masks on, and on the coalition side, one person. It was the weirdest thing I've seen, but that's about, you know, respecting, I suppose, the evidence of the experts, and just, you know, practicing what you preach.
Great.
Matt Bolsher's got a comment in there about the scale of vehicles. Certainly, the Milk Transport Operators Working Group is definitely taking note of the different scale of vehicles, and that I think it's been one of the major challenges for sanitising trucks for the dairy industry, is that people sort of said it's too hard, but we've got to take into account that yeah, there's a huge range of vehicles, and some of them are very big. And I think Chris and his working group have identified some practical approaches. We just have to see how well they work. There are other industries who definitely have applied this and applied in their everyday operation, whether there's disease outbreak or not. So that gives me faith there. Joe's comment is there can be as much soil on a hose as there is on boots. And again, in the description of what has to happen with milk tankers, certainly addresses the hose, the end caps, taps, all of it. So it's in there. If we miss describing that, that's there's a lot to cover for this session, and I apologise.
No, that is absolutely fine. And just another one, this came through privately, so you won't have seen this this one in the chat yet. But what is the rule or the process for disposing of cow carcasses which have been culled due to being infected?
Okay, so there are a number of different mechanisms described, and people who have memories long enough to remember the news footage of Wales and Shropshire in the UK in 2001, the pits of cows on fire. It sits in the manual, but it's just not going to be done. The public backlash against that was very significant, and it was very, very significant at the time in the UK. It certainly added a lot to the trauma of the response. But also, it's for Australia, depending on the time of the year, that may not be a very sensible way to try and dispose of animals. So the departments have, and the manuals have got descriptions of the burial process, so that's taking into account water table, catchment areas. They've been in discussion with catchment management authorities and the EPA. There's certainly discussion about there will be certain properties which can't, for various reasons, dispose of animals on the farm. So then there's already planning concepts in place for communal burial areas in areas which are sensible and safe. So burial is one part within the manual. Composting of carcasses is described, but the scale which euthanasia will occur on, that won't be practical. The size of the heap will have to be so very big. So most of it's going to be through burial, either on the property of origin or as a designated spot, and the control of movement of animals, euthanized animals off a farm to a communal spot, will have to fall in with the controls.
Right, thank you. I think Ash and Helen, that's the end of the questions now, is that?
It is. The only other one we've had Jeff submitted is just regards to any gaps with information getting out to processors. And as Helen said, agree with her comments there. Very keen to know. I mean, processors will know better than us if there are gaps. So yeah, very, very keen to hear what other info or what else the processors would like to see coming through.
So
can I try to wrap that into the last slide, if that's okay? Sorry, Bill. If you don't mind stopping sharing your screen so that I can.
Yeah, I was just going to say just one call out, which is definitely present it's not so much of a gap as that we just haven't got all it fully addressed, is how the control centres will interact with the individual processing businesses. Like there's description of having liaison people, for the actual operational protocols of how that work needs to be filled out a bit better, a bit more.
Great. All right. I've captured that, Bill. So this is an opportunity, hopefully, to have captured some of the outstanding items to follow up. And as you said, welcome your additional feedback into this as to what we may have missed. There was a number of queries around the notification process. So this is when there is a confirmed case, and just to get clarity around that process, just to sort of stop any whispers. Matt, I know you had a query around what has been the consumer response to dairy demand in the UK, so we can also follow that on more as an FYI. The milk tanker operator protocols for foot and mouth and lumpy skin disease. I know Chris is leading some work around that, as you said, that's going to look at collection, movement, delivery. The decontamination pieces come into that, both vehicle and people. And obviously, what does it mean in terms of processes agreement, in terms of movement between farms and then onto factories. Chris, I don't know if you wanted to touch on that, just to clarify the pre versus post farm gate status of that, and whether there are people online that would like to be part of that that may not already be part of it.
No, thanks, Janine. We're gathering a fair bit of information, and would like to share it with our group, but always anyone that would like to be a part of it, certainly open to that, because you know, a lot of the good information that is about is from in our own walls anyway. So there's some good stuff out there, but also other industries, what they're doing. You know, the piggeries and the chicken people, and also the feedlotters are probably as close to anyone of us. And with 400 feedlots up in Queensland, there's some good information coming from them. So we're going to go over a fair bit with our group next week. And anyone that wants to, provide any other information, certainly they can come back through yourself. That'll be great.
Great, thank you. So that's an action if anybody would like to be part of that. So the meeting is next week and we can certainly share the details for those that may be interested.
Yep.
Thank you, Chris. Milk disposal, and as you said, Bill, there's an action that the AusVet plan does cover off milk disposal in the manual, but there needs to be an additional component to that around the practical intervention. So we can certainly take that as an action and think about what that may look like. We were intending to come out with some checklists following on from today, just in terms of preparedness and incursion. So the intent was to try to summarise some of the key points that have come out of the presentations today and the questions. So hoping that then meets that requirement. And then the other one that we were asked for was some contact lists. So they're sort of the key items that I've captured as follow-up steps that are required. I've just put in here, and this obviously will be shared. So these were some of the key resources that have been made reference to. So the Dairy Australia webpage, trade, the foot and mouth disease free checklists, and farm biosecurity plans. So again, that's also housed on the Dairy Australia website. So I'm probably going to...
You might want to put the hotline on that number as well.
Yeah, absolutely can. So we're sort of open to yourselves now as to whether there are any last minute questions. I know we've kept you online nearly for the 2.5 hours. So just if there are any other resources that you would like to be developed over and above this. And then the other last question is, obviously we focus very much today on foot and mouth. So lumpy skin is whether there's some required information similar to today at this point in time, or whether we just sort of cover off foot and mouth and then we'll revisit lumpy skin. So I'm just sort of open whether there's any last questions, feedback, as you said, as to gaps in the information, what else we might be able to do, and then again, whether there's the need for lumpy skin disease training at this point as well.
Janine, it's Helen. Can I just add? It was great to have so many people answer the survey Janine sent out with the questions that you had. And that will be a great resource too, that will go back and make sure if there's anything in the questions or the issues or the areas or resources you raised that we haven't perhaps captured here, and make sure that we bring that into the discussion too.
And Janine, just on lumpy skin, I think almost the primary issue for milk tanker drivers, operators there, is the movement of insects.
Yeah.
So within the AusVet plan manuals, a lot of talk about tanker drivers keeping their cabins free of insects and keeping them sprayed with insecticide. So it's a totally different concept, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
But otherwise, not a strong implication for tanker movement. And there was a question asked, I think Matt, somebody might have been Matt, was asking about a withhold from foot and on vaccinated animals. Is there a withhold period? I can't answer officially to that, but I'd say no, because FMD has no human health implications. So it would only be around transfer of the virus, from animal to animal. So I can't see it. But just a top of thought response, top of mind.
So just on relation to the vaccines that are used, let's say in Southeast Asia, there is not a withhold period applied. The condition which may have a withhold applied to milking cows would be if there was some form of chemical preservative added in the vaccine manufacturing process. That's unlikely, but until we have the actual specific vaccine, we can't be more definitive than that.
Thank you. So we have had queries around how are we going to make sure that everybody stays abreast of what's going on. There is an industry briefing that Ash coordinates on behalf of Dairy Australia, and we do distribute it to our various channels. ADPF obviously has its e-alerts that it shares with members. So if anybody's not getting either of those information, please either reach out to myself or Ash, and we can certainly make sure you're added. And then of course you've got the Dairy Australia website, that's the central repository. So if there are no other queries or questions, I'm just conscious we're at our 10 to 3. There's obviously some big thank yous to people. Oh, sorry, Chris, have you still got your hand up?
I think he's clapping by the looks.
Oh, clapping, sorry. And so I never know whether they're claps, thumbs, ticks. Thank you, Chris.
Well, it is actually, but no, I just wanted to assure everybody that some of the pre-planning that's gone into this, as Justin and Bill have said, has gone back 20 years. The OSVAT plan or manuals have actually got, you know, some of the things that we're looking into right now that I referred to earlier. It's not as though we're starting from scratch. It's just a matter of looking at continuous improvement and updating with current styles, that's all. So, you know, it's not as though we've, you know, if it comes tomorrow, we're not starting with nothing. There's a lot of really good research there and through those OSVAT dairy manuals. So I just wanted to make sure that was in place there, Janine, and what we're doing is just looking at ways of improving if possible. That was all.
Beautiful.
Well done.
Thank you. And I just see Matt's last comment just around obviously capturing the information and whether we've sort of got a Q&A style type of resource that's available, so we can obviously look at that, Matt. So I just wanted to say some thank yous. Obviously today's session would have been made possible without the efforts of Justin and Bill, so an enormous amount of work that's gone in. Thank you both. And also Susanna. Supported also by Stu from a trade perspective, Joe and Chris, obviously for Milk Tanker, and Ash and Helen, who have certainly helped in terms of keeping us on track with all of our questions and responses. And as Helen said, we will go back and we'll make sure that we've addressed all of these questions in addition to those that you sent through with the survey, as well as back to the Dairy Australia questions from last Friday, just to check that we've covered all. And again, all of that information will be made available. So our next steps, as we said, is the recording will be made available, the presentations will be made available, and we do have a raft of resources, obviously, that we will follow up with as well. If there is anybody that's not receiving regular insights and updates, again, please reach out to myself or Ash. Otherwise, thank you all for your participation, and we will convene these as we need to, just to make sure, again, that everybody's kept up to speed. So thank you all, and have a lovely rest of Friday afternoon and long weekend.
Thanks.
Sorry, not long weekend.
Thank you. See you.
Thanks, Janine.
Thank you.